Hey there, welcome to this week's episode of That's Not Proper, and I'm your host, Kapono Asuncion. Today we have a special guest again returning, Pono. Please listen with an open heart. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to private message me or comment on a post on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. In addition to that, you can email me at that'snotpropercorey@gmail.com. Please share, rate, and review this podcast on whichever podcast platform you are listening on, and enjoy today's episode. Today we are going to be doing part 2 of Love, Respect, Equality, You Are Worthy. And today with me again is Pono. Hi, Pono.
Hi.
I think real quick, I want to tell the listeners that it would be a really fabulous idea if they went ahead and listened to part 1 in case they have not heard it. It would be good just to kind of give them a ballpark idea of what we're talking about here today. But for those that have listened, Pono was very gracious and discussed with me the story of what he has chosen for his body and for his sexuality and for his gender. And so today we are going to touch down a little bit on the story that he shared with us, but also we're going to delve a little bit deeper into issues that are prevalent right now, especially within the transgender community. Pono, one thing that you and I had discussed was gender dysphoria.
Mm-hmm.
And I had told you that I had an issue with that phrase or term. And my issue was more that in my mind, when I hear the word dysphoria, and even when you go, like, if you go look it up on Webster's dictionary or whatever, one of the words that's used to define it is confusion. In my mind, and as I'm, attempting to understand everything, I didn't like the word confusion because I felt like it gave some, especially hate, a word and a term to use in a negative. And dysphoria kind of were like along the same lines. And I didn't care for that because I felt like, no, this is you. You have found out who you are. So it's no longer confusion necessarily. But you and I discussed that and you shed some light on that term for me. And
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing to recognize is that there are a lot of layers to the term dysphoria. It can be a very loaded term, and it's important to kind of try to pull apart the different meanings that it has in different contexts. So the first context that I would look at is the context of trans people using this term to describe how they feel about their gender. And it is a term that can capture a lot of things, but for a lot of people, it captures the discomfort, anxiety, different sorts of negative feelings that come with being misgendered, being in a body that you don't feel like it reflects your gender in a way that you're comfortable with. So that's kind of like the first layer. That's how a lot of trans people use it, and that's how I've used it to describe my own experiences. And then also you have to look at it from how the medical industry uses it, because there's this long history of medicalizing trans bodies and kind of characterizing them as deviant or having some sort of disease. And so that's kind of where the term dysphoria came from, is this way to make these feelings of incongruence with your birth gender as something that has to be treated medically. In addition to people using it as an empowering term, it can also be really limiting because people can weaponize this term to characterize trans people as diseased, to make it some sort of pathology or matter of pathology. But then again, using dysphoria in the medical sense also allows people access to medical care, gender affirming care. And there's this process when you're trying to access means of medical transition of other people outside of your experience who are positioned as experts on trans people. They kind of have to certify you as having dysphoria in order to access care. So there's also that problematic, unequal power relationship between the medical industry and hospitals and doctors and social workers and therapists and trans people. It's a very complex term. It's really important to know how it's being used in different contexts. And then I think also what's not talked about as much, but that goes hand in hand with talking about dysphoria, is also gender euphoria, which
Okay.
can kind
Oh,
of be
yes, we
seen,
talked about that.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it can kind of be seen as the opposite of gender dysphoria. So it's a feeling of joy and comfort and feeling at home in your body and feeling like your gender is being validated, whether that's internally or externally by people or by some sort of clothing that you're wearing. And that's also really important because there's this debate right now, especially within the trans community, that says that you have to have dysphoria in order to be labeled trans. And this ends up excluding a lot of people because a lot of trans and non-binary people don't actually experience dysphoria. They wouldn't describe what they experience as dysphoria. They would actually um, talk about their experience as finding things that help them experience increased gender euphoria. And that's also important because dysphoria also allows the exclusion of some trans people from the trans community, which I don't think should be happening, because I think the only requirement of being trans is that you identify yourself as such.
And I think that's what my issue with that term, was dysphoria. And I truly appreciate you, helping me to understand, because
Mhm.
there's some of these things you can go online and I can type in this term and I can get, the definition according to the medical community. I can get the
Right.
definition according to some other, hate group. I can get the definition according to somebody that is within the transgender community. And it was kind of all over the place. And so
Mhm.
having you kind of give me a little bit more info into it was really, really helpful, just in understanding it some more. It's still one of those things that when I hear it, I hate the idea that the medical community has made it like they have to have a term to say that you can be who you are.
Mhm.
And that's probably where my biggest struggle with that was. But
Right.
I appreciated you explaining it to me. And then even with regards to gender euphoria, I had heard that term, but I
Mhm.
didn't really know what it meant. And it just enlightened me in a way that I did not have an understanding of before. And I truly appreciate that.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's just important to realize. I think with all terms and with all the terms and concepts that we're about to talk about, they can be both empowering and limiting. And I think understanding that there's always going to be contradictions within those terms will be important for the conversation moving forward, and for everyone to understand as they're listening to this.
We had talked about some other terms too. And even this morning, when you and I were talking, you had said something that with regards to some terms, and we weren't talking just specifically with regards to gender dysphoria as a
Hmm.
term, but other terms that are used within your community. That I said, growing up, born in the 70s, a product of the 80s and early
Hmm.
90s, and a lot of terms within the LGBTQ community, even just, the L, the G, the B, the T, the Q, all of
Hmm.
that, those were terms that were used in a very negative light.
Right.
Now, when I was in, high school or even in grammar school, the most common term that was used was gay.
Hmm.
And it was always a term that was used in a negative way. It was
Hmm.
even, whether it be referring to someone, or if, if someone would say, quote unquote, that's gay, things like that. There was a negativity around it. And so you and I discussed that I have a hard time with any of the terms that makes me think of back then when it was used in a negative way. And I know that there are still people, especially my generation and previous, that hear these terms and they associate them in a negative way, and they continue to use them in a negative way. And so it's hard for me to sometimes
Hmm.
use them because I just want to say, no, that's Pono. And, that's my sibling. And that's that. I don't understand why we've got to have all these terms.
Hmm.
And that's just a personal thing. But
Right.
there was something you had said that what it is that is a radical act of reclaiming.
Hmm.
And if you could kind of expound on that, because when you said
Sure.
radical act of reclaiming, that hit me. And so I'd love for you to kind of
Yeah.
expound on that.
Yeah, so again, it's really important to think about the context that these terms are being used in. So like you said, a lot of these terms have been used to oppress people, pretty much, and to
Yes.
perpetuate violence.
Right.
And so the people that these terms are being used against, and this is also dependent on the person who's using the term, but to turn around and to use these terms to describe yourself and to use it as a crucial component of describing your identity, you are taking the power of the term and the history of that term and the violence and trauma associated with it, and you're turning it on its head, and you're using that to reclaim power and to reclaim that term as something positive. And so, for example, like I identify myself as queer, and so and that's a term that has been used for a long time
Mhm.
to denigrate people who may not identify themselves as queer, but are perceived or known by other people to be gay or to identify in some way with the queer community. And so for myself, using the term queer to describe myself is a way to combat that power and to kind of challenge that structure, those structures of oppression that tell me that being queer is a bad thing. And I'm using it as a positive way to describe how I relate to myself and how I relate to others. And so, yeah, it's really important to look at the context in which it's being used. And I think it's also important to know that the language that you use is very important, and to think about if if you use the term queer and you don't identify as queer, or you aren't, like, for example, if we're expanding past the queer community, if you are not Black and you use the N-word, you are invoking that violence, and you are
Mhm.
kind of ignoring that history, and you are using it in the way that it has been used for so long to perpetuate violence. But it's not the same thing as someone who does identify with that group using it. And I think we have to pull that apart and understand that terms are very important, and labels are important to describe your identity, but also not everyone will be comfortable with those terms. It's really important to understand how these terms are used and what context they're being used in, and what history is attached to these words. And also, as I talk about this, I want to make sure that I'm not perceived as the voice for all marginalized communities, and there are ways in which I am privileged. And so there's also a huge need for me to be careful about the terms that I used, and being cognizant of the fact that my experiences do not capture all experiences of oppression and violence. And so when I talk about using these terms, there's also I will definitely also have blind spots and things to learn. And I think that's important because it signifies that everyone has things to learn. Everyone has
Right.
some sort of privilege that they need to interrogate.
I
Yeah.
agree. And I think that that's really important, especially that's part of the reason why, I wanted to do this podcast was I say it in almost every podcast episode I've done is the idea that we need to create community and unity and understanding, and it cannot be done by sitting in silence. It has to be done by having this open line of communication and
Yeah.
creating a discourse that so that we can all come and sit together and discuss it. And if you can't discuss it, then get off the table. I mean,
Mhm.
that's kind of my that's or get away from the table, step away from the table,
Yeah.
go back
Stuff
to the
like that.
kitchen. I don't know. I'm just saying, if we can't sit down and discuss it, if it'll only create division. And
Mhm.
that's what I'm really hoping that something like this can do, is this open this line of communication. And
Mhm.
I think it's important that you share that, yes, this is your experience and everybody's got a different experience. And I think that that's a lot of what this is about. You and I have discussed that not every person that is transgender has the exact same experience, and
Right.
you for yourself chose different things but that doesn't necessarily mean you are transgender and the person that who did something different is not transgender. And I think
Exactly.
that that's important that we discuss that it is different. It's just like you and me and myself and my daughters, we are all individuals, likes and dislikes, and how we
Mhm.
feel and how we present ourselves, and where we're comfortable and how we're comfortable. We are each individuals, and that's what's so fabulous about that, is because we're so unique, each and every one of us, we can bring that to the table to create this amazing ball of wonderfulness,
Mhm.
if you want to
Mhm.
call it that, because we are so individual and unique. And I would hope that someone be able to see it from that aspect as well.
Right.
One thing you had brought up a second ago, and you and I discussed this before, and it is really
Mhm.
important that we break this down a little bit. Man, I think we could talk about it for
Mhm.
hours, but there is a huge issue with violence and oppression in, well, all of the LGBTQ community, but
Mhm.
specifically with regards to transgender women,
Mhm.
and even more specifically with regards to Black transgender
Right.
women. What I had noticed the other day when I had shared that little graphic with regards to the Transgender Day of Remembrance, that it was something like
Mhm.
85% of those within the United States that were known that had been murdered were transgender women of color.
Right.
And I think it's really important. One, so Pono, are you white?
I have a white parent, so I would say that I'm half white. I'm mixed, and so I don't identify as white. I would identify as mixed race, as Puerto Rican and Filipino and Hawaiian and brown. So
Brown, yeah.
yes.
With regards to yourself and with regards to
Right.
your community, if you could just kind of share with us the struggles there and how much of an issue this really is.
I think the first thing to recognize is that different forms of oppression, so transphobia, uh, homophobia, racism, and so on, ableism, and all these things, classism, they all intersect and they all inform each other. And so you can be trans and you can be white, and so you're trans, and so you do not benefit from systems of oppression that operate on gender, but you do benefit from the institution of whiteness and racism. And so that's really important to understand, because as a brown trans mask person, and as someone who comes from a financially stable family and who has not had to worry about being in poverty and the things that come with not having a stable income, I am privileged in a lot of ways, and so I as a trans person have to decenter myself from the conversation, and we have to talk about people who are at the intersections of all these different forms of oppression, and that is Black trans women and trans femmes. Because I think there's a statistic out there. This might not be updated, but I mean, it's the spirit of it is still there. But the fact that Black trans women are 8 times more likely to die of a hate crime than any other group. And so there's all these intersecting systems of oppression that we have to talk about when we talk about trans issues, because if not, we end up centering white trans people, or we end up centering white middle class trans people, and we ignore the fact that Black trans women are dying, and Black trans women face huge rates of violence and sexual assault, and so many different things. And so yeah, it's really important to talk about race and class and other categories of identity in relation to gender as well.
Prior to kind of investigating that a little bit, I didn't really realize. And after I thought about it, there was a part of it that, it made some sense. So when you take a look, I think it was RAIN that had put it out,
Mm-hmm.
RAINN.org, rain.org. The statistics of crimes, who commits them with regards to acts of violence and
Mm-hmm.
rape, mass shootings, things like that. It was something crazy, like 85% or higher were men, white men.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at these crimes that are being committed, these acts of violence, murders against Black transgender women,
Mm-hmm.
they are being committed by men.
Right.
And so cisgender men.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is an issue. And so would you, looking at that and hearing those statistics, or with regards to your personal experience as
Yeah.
far as struggles that you may have, do you notice that there is a larger struggle with that you maybe feel oppressed or hatred from with regards to cisgender white men?
Yeah, so I think that when we talk about intersecting oppressions, we also have to talk about intersecting privileges. And I know privilege can be a loaded term for a lot of people, but privilege is just basically the fact that society is set up to benefit some people while at the cost of others. So when we talk about cis white men, you have to think about how our society values a certain type of masculinity, a certain body, and a certain identity that is whiteness. And so intersecting privileges also create violence. Yeah, and so thinking about my own experience, I think it's been very
Especially
interesting.
coming from an
Yeah,
area where you lived
right.
in the States, because right now you're in London. So
Yeah,
when you were in the States, you lived in a predominantly white community. And so I didn't know if there specifically the struggles there, and especially like versus now being in London, where you saw it more, what the issues were with for your own self.
in kind of suburban Minnesota, Rochester,
Mhm.
Minnesota. I did go to a primarily white school and I had primarily white friends. A lot of the things that I experienced were sort of microaggressions that kind of exotified my body in some way. Like I was told that
Mhm.
that I was so exotic and my lips and things about I was told that I like had a big exotic butt. Like so it's things like that where
Right.
that's a lot of what I experienced was things about my body and things about
So some objectification.
objectification, yes, and in relation to race. So it was racialized objectification. Yeah, and I think also I have to also acknowledge that as a brown person who is also white passing in some context, so people perceive me as white or perceive me as somehow adjacent to whiteness. There's a lot
Mhm.
of privilege that goes along with that. I think I also was able to navigate these spaces easier than if I was not white passing. And so yeah, there's a lot of things to be unpacked there. But yeah, and now in London, it's very interesting because I don't think race is talked about in the same way in the UK. So
Curious about that. Yeah.
yeah, it's racism is definitely prevalent and systemic everywhere in different ways, and it's also talked about in different ways. What I've experienced is racism is kind of seen as a problem of the United States that is not as prevalent in the UK, and
It
class is
doesn't surprise me at
seen
all.
as more central to the issues that we
Mhm.
have in the UK, which is not true at all. Racism is definitely prevalent in the US and in the UK and everywhere
Mhm.
else because it's a systemic issue that operates in different ways in different places. Yeah, so there's an interesting thing with me trying to find spaces that for queer and trans people of color, and there's a lot of intersections that go into that.
Okay, with you saying that, Pono, previously, I believe we might have discussed it on the last episode. You and I have had these conversations also separately from the
Mhm.
podcast with regards to boxes. And what I mean by boxes is everybody for some reason, and I do it myself,
Mhm.
we want to put people into boxes, and I'm sure there's some sort of psychological reason for that, but I do believe that it has to do with something that we'll touch down a little bit, colonization. But we want to put everybody into a box so that we can identify them for some reason.
Mhm.
And so that when I say these boxes, these boxes are about, that I'm thinking of right now specifically are gender and race and sexuality and how those all come into play and the issue that it can create when we attempt to say, oh, they have to fit into this box in order to
Mhm.
fit into my idea of how things are going to operate going forward from here. And so for yourself, how have you navigated that so as to, I mean, are you okay with the boxes, or are you trying to step outside of these boxes so that you could be seen as an individual and just Pono versus having to have a label in a sense or a box that you fit into for everybody else?
Yeah, so I think labels have been really important for me in a lot of ways because As I was growing up, there were these feelings of discomfort and fear, but they were really, I didn't know how to identify them. I didn't have any words for them, and so they kind of just became part of me and part of my reality. And
So it's almost like you're able to give it a name.
yeah, right. You're able to give it a name. And so
Okay.
labels are really important in that way if they're used for self identification. But yeah, and in another way, again, they can be really limiting and perpetuate violence because if other people are ascribing you these labels, they are characterizing you by a certain set of characteristics that say this is who you are and you cannot be anything else. And
That was my thought about it, was that when someone, let's take myself for example, white female,
mhm,
woman, whatever. And so then the box that's ticked usually, she likes Starbucks.
yeah,
She wears these clothes. She goes to these places. She does these things. This is how this white woman behaves. And so that I hate those boxes being ticked off. But what I'm gathering from what you're telling me though is that some of these boxes are labels that you were able to identify for yourself, enabled you to maybe gain a better understanding of who you are
right.
and what that means as far as going forward.
Yeah, and I think it's also again it's important to see who's using these labels and what is being named because I think when historically marginalized communities use labels to describe themselves, that is empowering, and when labels are imposed on historically marginalized groups, that's where the systematic oppression comes in. But also, I think it's really important for us to be able to name whiteness, to name gender, and to name class, and to have these labels because it's naming a system and it's naming oppression because whiteness is a system of systematic oppression and it is very particular notions of power. And so I think it's really important to understand again what labels are being used and who they're being used by and what the effects of that are. It's different and there's no universal rule for
Mhm.
labels and how they're used because we have to look at the effects, the context, the history. And so, and a lot of people will get angry about that. They'll say you're putting me in a box by saying, for example, I think this comes up a lot, like, oh, I'm just a white straight man, and that's all I am to you. You have to be able to name those privileges, and you have to be able to name those systems that you benefit from in order to be self-reflective and in order for other people to name the systems that you're complicit in and the systems that are affecting you. So again, yeah, labels are limiting and empowering and also just wholly depend on context.
But what you just said right there too, with regards to the importance, especially when you're saying, your example was a white straight man, a white straight man.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important too that we discuss, or at least there's that open communication. I think a lot of people, and this is something I kind of had to come to an understanding, and I'm still coming to an understanding with. I
Mm-hmm.
can't change my whiteness,
Right.
but as far as my physical features, I cannot change that. But what I can do, and especially when we're talking about these topics specifically,
Mm-hmm.
is I can be cognizant. I can be aware of where my ethnicity, my race, my sexuality, my gender, what privileges and whatnot that presents for me in this
Right.
society. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that that's a lot of the misunderstanding is, oh, it's a racing now. Oh, now because you want this in your life, then now it's all about white people and how they've done this. And I don't think it's necessarily about that. I think it's bringing to this table where we're discussing the awareness that my race has given me abilities that others do not and may never have. And so taking that understanding and taking that label that I've been given and using it as a platform to promote equality for other people, regardless of what box that they've been placed in, and using that to promote, like I said, the equality for others.
Right.
Would you
And
agree that that's the kind of the idea when this topic comes up? Because you see it, you see the rage. Oh, they said I'm white. Oh, that's the same as me saying they're not. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, and it's I think something that kind of makes it easy to understand is when you ask someone to acknowledge their white privilege, you are not asking them to say that their life is easy, that they've had a really easy, beautiful life because they're white. What you are saying, though, is that their life has not been made harder by their race. They have received benefits at the cost of someone else that they may not notice. So let's say you got promoted for a job or you got called in for an interview. What you don't know, if you do not expand your understanding of racism from individual to systemic, is that there were most likely other people who were passed up in order for you to get that job. And
Okay,
yeah.
that I want to talk about that because with regards to, thank you for segueing that for me. That with regards to the transgender community
Hmm.
and this, struggle of lacking that privilege because they've been placed in these boxes of gender
Right.
or sexuality, whatever box someone has chosen to place them in, there has got to be a struggle with regards to employment and housing
Mhm.
and shopping, even, basic, simple things, using the bathroom, that thing that I said, this
Yeah.
stupid frickin' bathroom issue. The people just want to pee, man. Would you say then that because of this presents some issues within the transgender community for simple things that maybe we're not even recognizing because we go day to day and don't have that issue?
Simple answer is yes. Like, I just thinking about examples in my own life, simple things that I worry about every day or that I did worry about. For example, before I was able to get my driver's license changed from my gender marker going from female to male, every time I wanted to go out with friends and present my ID to, if I was going out and buying a drink, that was a constant point of anxiety. Going into bathrooms, like the fact that, like, for example, like I went out to a club with some friends and I had to go to the bathroom, and obviously I sit when I pee, and so I go into the bathroom and all the stalls are taken up and there's like 3 urinals free, and like 3 guys were like, "Hey man, like why don't you use the urinal? Do you have to take a poop?" And so it's like like it's things like that where I have to explain my presence, worrying about whether,
Which, by
like,
the way, people
yeah.
never ask someone if they've got a poo inside.
Exactly. That's a weird thing to ask someone. Why are you asking me that?
Weird.
Like,
Oh God.
and then I just have to be like, all right, well, I just have to accept that every time I go in the bathroom, people are like, oh, yeah, they're pooping. But anyways, like, for example, like at my school, because I went to a women's Catholic university, like everyone else is just able to like kind of walk through the school being perceived as a woman, but like trans and non-binary people, like especially people who visibly seemingly out of place like me, my presence was constantly interrogated. I would go into my hall of residence and the RAs would be like, what are you doing in here? You have to have an escort. And so I was made to feel uncomfortable in
Mm.
my own living space. So there's so many examples of just daily life where there's just things that I'm worrying about that, yeah, that cis people don't have to worry about. But also, like, I have a lot of privilege in the fact that I'm read as a man, and so I'm not visibly not conforming to norms of gender and norms of sex. So I'm also really protected in a lot of ways. So I think that's also important to acknowledge. But yeah, there's definitely things that I worry about in my day-to-day life that if I was not trans, that would not be an issue.
You've been going through this process now for approximately, we said, about 2 years or so,
Mhm.
2.5 years. In that period of time, have you seen any change with regards to those types of things for the better? There's like a progression of understanding or a progression of safety and security that's being promoted?
Yeah, I think so, and I think a lot of it has to do with my physical appearance. I think a lot of the reason that people are able to listen to me talk about being trans and are able to engage with me is because they see me as a comfortable person, because while I'm trans and while I'm non-binary, I still somehow fit into their conceptions of male and female, and so it's easily
Because of your appearance, you
digested.
mean?
Exactly, yeah, because of my appearance, and there's a lot of safety that comes with that, because like when I was navigating the world as a woman, and I'd be walking down the street alone, and you get catcalled, you
Mhm.
avoid dark corners, you do all these things to try to to think about your safety, which you shouldn't have to do. And now I'm kind of on the opposite side of that. And because I've experienced that, I'm very cognizant of how I occupy space in public, because I don't know, I'm a tall, cis-looking person, male-looking person, and so I'm also really aware of the ways that I can affect other people's feelings of safety and comfort, and so
It's
that's really
funny you say
interesting to me.
that because I was just discussing with someone the issue, that's presented for women and myself, I'm older now, so I don't get catcalled like I used to when
Yeah.
I was a kid, but that constant, I think a lot of people and a lot of probably men don't realize that women, many women live their lives not necessarily in fear,
Hmm.
but subconsciously, constantly aware of their environment and where they're at and where they're going, and do I have my keys, and my don't look at your phone, oh look, check everybody out that's in the parking lot, because what if this person does this, and why is that guy staring at me, why are they so close, you have that, and I don't think a lot of men understand that necessarily. However, you have experienced that, so you have an understanding. And wow, I'm really appreciative of that, because it's a difficult thing to explain to someone. Hey, when I just go to the store to go grab milk,
Hmm.
there's probably 30 million things that are going on in my head that all have to do with being safe, making
Exactly.
sure,
Yeah.
and it's a struggle. And so would you say then that you have in it, with regards to the transgender community, a privilege in the sense that you don't have to struggle with those same issues, because you had the privilege of the appearance, and
Hmm.
were able to take tea? Because I think we had talked about before that not necessarily every transgender person has the ability or
Hmm.
even the desire necessarily
Hmm.
to go through some of the things that you had opted to go through.
Yeah, I definitely have privilege when it comes to both my gender expression, because I'm not visibly gender nonconforming, because I tend to wear clothes that are coded as masculine. I have a deep voice. I have like a pretty like solid physical presence, so I don't feel that physical threat anymore, unless I'm in a space where there's a risk of me outing myself, which can then kind of flip the situation. But yeah, for sure, like women, and also trans and non-binary women and femmes, there's so much violence and hatred and fear that comes from the public, that they are in constant they're constantly aware of the sort of violence they face. So yeah, there's definitely a privilege with being kind of masculinely coded, and also quote unquote passing as someone who aligns with the gender binary.
Recently, I had watched it was just a quick video, and I'm really irritated right now because I cannot remember. It might have come, I think it's Attitude Magazine, it might be, but they had a video. It was some transgender women, actually
Mm-hmm.
in London area, I believe, and they were discussing the struggle that they have there with regards to violence.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to that, though, it was important to me to hear them discuss this, and I think it's important to discuss it here, that they are assumed to be sexual deviants.
Mm.
And now, growing up, again, I talked about that earlier, especially growing up in a religious community, anytime someone had chosen to love or like or be with someone of the same sex,
Mm-hmm.
it was always about sex, as far as the religious community's mindset was. Oh, this is because they are sexually deviant. They're going to bring up Sodom and Gomorrah and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. And I think it's really important that we discuss that, because I know for a fact that that's not it. I mean, there's sexual deviance all over the place. I don't care what your sexual preference is. They're all over the place.
Mhm,
And but the big thing that I always heard growing up, and I still hear, especially when you're talking about, the silent generation or
mhm,
boomers, or even still some within my generation, Generation X. There's this thought that anyone who goes outside of what society has told us is the quote unquote norm, straight,
mhm,
it's solely because of sexually deviant desires. And
mhm.
so I would like to kind of hear if you've had to deal with that, or if you've had to
Yeah.
address that, or position on that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because first, people confuse gender and sexuality,
Mhm.
and which are fundamentally different things. Like, you can be trans and gay, you can be trans and straight, you can be trans and queer, and so on. And so I think that's the first kind of misconception there, is that your gender has something to do with your sexuality, when they're very different from each other. They're distinct. They can inform each other. They are not the same thing. So I think that that's the first thing that I would say. And then the second thing about deviance and deviant sexuality being attached to being trans, I think that just goes back to kind of the dominant ideas about heterosexuality, about gender roles. And this all comes down to what has been or forcefully imposed by institutions in power to make us believe certain things about sex and about gender. And so, what I would say to people who believe that, or there's a thing such as deviant sexuality, is that you've got some unlearning to do, and that's basically that's what I would say. You've got to do a lot of research, a lot of reading, and understanding that this is not and has not ever been the only way to perform gender and to have sex. It's a very There are very particular norms set in very particular histories, which we could get into, but it's just understanding that these are constructions that are located in a certain context. Let's see. So, lastly, have I experienced that? I have gotten a lot of questions like pertaining to, let's say I disclose myself as trans. They're like, "Oh, so who do you date?" And I'm like, "Well, that's a different question, but
Mhm.
while you're asking, like, I'm attracted to anybody." But they're like, "Oh, so how does that work? Does that make, like, if women dated you, does that mean they're gay?" And I'm like, "Nope. That means that they're attracted to the gender that I am." And so there's a lot of explaining to do there. People ask who I'm attracted to and what it means for other people to be attracted to me. Like, it's
Isn't it
interesting.
weird to be asked those questions? Because I have to say that I've never been asked those questions. And it's just always mind boggling to me that people are like, I mean, I understand the curiosity. To be
Yeah.
fair, I do understand the curiosity because there's a lack of understanding. But honestly, I would never be like, so then,
Right.
what do you
Right.
like? I mean, I've never been asked that, so why would anyone think it's okay then to just walk up to another human being and be like, so how do you like it and from who and where you at?
Yeah.
It just is so bizarre to me.
Yeah, and it's like people ask me like what is in my pants, like what sort of genitalia I have, and I'm like, dude, would you ask this about anyone else?
To
Like,
anybody?
yeah, like
Yeah.
everyone's sexuality and sex life and what's in their pants is very individual to them, and there's no like blanket rule that says you should like go and ask a trans person these things. And
Well,
yes,
exactly. You wouldn't ask your mom or your sister or
so,
you're not, you know what I mean? Say, don't, why would you feel that you're comfortable enough? The weird thing is that there's that comfort in a sense, because walking up and asking someone, especially someone who you don't know very well about those things, is you have a real odd sense of comfort with asking me these things, but not asking them to anybody else. I think that you and I discussed this a little bit too. Just even the idea of sex, and this is why I said I want to do another podcast on, especially women, but talking about sex is not really something you do with your neighbor, but or somebody you just walked up on the street. But I think that a lot of these curiosities and questions that people so weirdly decide to voice to people they don't know very well have something to do with the fact that as a society, especially my generation, you don't talk about sex. You don't talk about sex with your partner. You don't talk about
Mhm.
sex with your parents. Sex is something that's taboo. Almost felt like growing up, sex was actually, it was like not okay. It was used just for
Yeah.
procreation solely, because that's another big thing is people think, well, sex is supposed to be about, making babies and not about pleasure and enjoyment as
Yeah.
in addition to that and expression of, feeling or whatever. This curiosity comes from the inability to understand that you can be open sexually with your partner and how to express that, but also learning there are times to not talk to people about that because it's none of your freaking business. It's like children, toddlers, when they say crazy things, they just walk up and like when my kids, would say things. That guy's fat, and they're like, oh,
Yeah.
good God,
Yeah.
you don't want them to say that. That's what it makes me think of is children just walking up and saying these asinine things because they haven't learned or understood or even desired to understand yet that there's a time and a place, but also what's going on in your pants? What's going on in your life? How about you address that
Yeah.
first, without me, and then we can have these types of conversations where we know that there's no agenda here because I think there's an agenda frequently behind that as well.
Yeah, I think there's a certain, like, talking about that comfort that people have in asking trans people like very invasive questions. There's a certain entitlement
Mm.
that cis people have to trans bodies. And again, like, this is not an individual condemnation of all cis people. It's a systemic thing that has been taught over and over again, that we have some sort of entitlement to bodies that we don't understand. And then also, yeah, I don't think people would be asking these questions as much if we had good sex education and in
Mhm.
schools, and good, like, norms of being able to openly discuss sex without shame or stigma being attached to it. But yeah, like, the fact of the matter is that, like, sex ed in the US is horrible, and so people go to other avenues for information when really, like, we should be talking about different bodies and different genders and different sexualities and consent and all these things in school, but people just don't talk about it. And so that's why you get 25-year-olds asking me very invasive questions, because first, they weren't taught in sex ed that you don't just ask invasive questions about other people's bodies, but second, that they just don't know any way to exist outside a binary sex and gender system and what that means for someone's sex life.
Two things, and then we're going to close it out here. One, I'm going to share a question from a listener. And I just wanted to let you know the feedback I did get. I do need more people to ask questions. It's interesting to me because I know there are questions because people have asked me things in the past, and so it's like, oh, hello, where were you
Mhm.
this week? But a really excellent question was sent in by a listener, and I want to have you address that.
Sure.
In addition to that, though, and I hope I'm not totally putting you on the spot, though, with regards to yourself and the
Mhm.
transgender community, what would you say are some of, or maybe the biggest myth
Mm.
and misunderstanding that you would like first and foremost to address to someone who is maybe just coming to an understanding or seeking understanding, or maybe just even ignorant?
Mm. That's a big question. I'll do maybe like three big ones because I
Okay.
don't know if I can choose. I think the first one is that people are relying on their middle school biology curriculum or whatever they've learned in like seventh grade, and they're applying that understanding to trans people. So I see this constantly in day-to-day life and comment sections on YouTube and Instagram and Facebook, but there's this thing like, if you have a penis, you are a man. If you have a vagina, you are a woman. It's basic biology. You like,
Right.
so there's rhetoric like that. And the fact is that both sex and gender are constructed, and there's a lot of like professional scientific writing on this that says that, I won't get into this, but sex is also constructed and gender is constructed, and it's never as simple as, if you're a man, you have a penis, and if you're a woman, you have a vagina, and that's it. That's just it. That's not accurate in any sense of the word. And we can get into that later. But so that's the first sort of misconception. The second is the fact that people perceive trans people who pursue medical transition as somehow messing with what they're naturally given, and messing with, like, if you're coming from a religious point of view, messing with God's plan, messing with what's natural. No one's body is pure or natural. Like, there's all of these sorts of forces that are both intentional and unintentional acting on your body at all times that are constantly changing it. And so there's this lack of self-reflection thinking about that, because I mean, think about braces, Botox, cosmetic surgeries, and you can go on and on. Like, there are always things that people are doing to modify their bodies, which isn't to say that medical transition is purely cosmetic, because it's not, but that there's that sort of idea that trans people are like this certain group set aside from society that are doing these drastic things to their bodies that there's no precedent for, or that is just somehow so outside of the realm of comprehension. And that's just not true. And then the third misconception is the debate around pronouns, and people just kind of see it as, oh, I'm just going to call you what you are. I'm going to stick to reality. And this, you're making such a big fuss about pronouns. It's not a big deal. They're just words. And again, that's just not true. Pronouns are such a integral part of who you are. And it's such a big part of feeling comfortable and feeling like other people see you for who you are. And like, for cis people, I would just say, just imagine if you are a woman and you identify as a woman, like, if people just constantly said he to you and addressed you by some other name, and like just did these things constantly, and you constantly felt like you had to correct people, like, it's such an important part of who you are. And it's not just words, and language isn't just language. It has huge impacts. So yeah, I think those are the three things that I would say.
Those are good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so what I'm going to do then is I'm going to read the email, most of the email, not all of it, that was sent to me. And you and I discussed this a little bit beforehand. And this email was sent to me from a mom. And she says, first of all, thank you, Pono, for your bravery and honesty. You seem like the kind of person who would be a great role model for trans and gender expansive youth. I did have a question, if he is willing to share. How does he make peace with the life he lived as a girl and then as a woman? My son won't look at old photographs or really talk much about what life was like before transition. He destroyed or threw away anything that had his dead name on it, even special mementos. As a parent, this breaks my heart. I feel like he wants to erase his early childhood, but I look back on all those memories and see a child that was always loved and I had thought was happy. How can I better understand how he feels and perhaps help him to reconcile his past with his future? Her background. I'm a parent of a transmasculine child. My son is 13, almost 14. He came out about 2.5 years ago. We were astonished, but managed to keep up, and has been on T for about 2 years. We have had his name and all his legal documents changed to reflect his preferred name and gender, and he has top surgery scheduled for spring of 2020.
First of all, I just want to say to this mom that she's a fantastic mom. I think that you can really tell just by that email how much love and consideration and kindness and support and unconditional love that is going into her relationship with her son. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. And then second, that her feelings are valid, and that it's perfectly normal as a parent to feel these sorts of things. I know that my mom went through similar feelings. And then third, I want to say before I start answering this question that, again, like, I'll be speaking from my own experience, and I don't want to be speaking for her son, because he might be going through different sorts of feelings. So I'll just explain from my perspective, and this might help shed light on how people feel about this. But again, yeah, I just want to clarify that I won't be able to speak for other people. When I think about or see pictures of myself from before I transitioned and before I realized that I was trans. And I've gone through Facebook. I've untagged myself from some pictures. I've taken some pictures down from my Instagram. I've asked my mom to replace pictures in our house with some updated ones of me now. And I think that has been that process of removing pictures for me has been this process of reclaiming control over this discomfort and fear and pain that I was feeling when I was younger, but I couldn't really name. And so now that I can look back and understand those feelings, understand why I felt like something was off, is really important to me. So being able to take those pictures away and having control over that is something that I've never had control over before. So
Mm.
that's one part of it. And then I think that what's important in this, or what was important for my family to know in this process, and this isn't information that my family was owed, but I found it helpful to explain this to them when they expressed feelings of grief or feelings of sadness that I was somehow trying to leave my childhood with them behind and trying to leave the person that they knew behind for this new person. I just reminded them that I'm still here. I'm still the same person that grew up with you and that you've known since I was a baby. And I hold all those memories within me. Like, those are tangible manifestations of my memories, but when I get rid of them or like put them somewhere else, that's not getting rid of them, because I mean, they're who I am. That's part of me. My family is who I am. And so you can never sort of cut that out of yourself. And so that's something that I had to remind them, is that I'm still here. Those memories, more important than being in those pictures, are in me. And I think that's really important to think about. And then, so also thinking about my relationship with my younger self, and this has been a really long process, and it's not anything that can be accelerated. It's just something that happens over time and with a lot of support. Like, in the past year, I've done a lot of reflection about who that younger self is and how they're a part of me now. And actually, one really cool thing that I did as part of this process for a class assignment, I had to write a short story about something to do with liberated futures, which was the subject of my class. And so I ended up writing a short story about visiting my younger self in my dreams and reassuring them that I've figured it out, that the pain and discomfort that they're feeling has a name to it, and that they're going to be okay. And so there's this process of remembering my younger self in a way that is healing. And so there's that sort of like self-reflexive conversation with myself that I've been able to have. And so I have found peace and healing with myself, and it's made it easier to look at old pictures of myself. But I still, there still are pictures that I look at and I can remember the specific points of discomfort that I was feeling in that moment. And I can almost, like, that feeling almost returns in my body of wanting to curl up and hide myself, but also trying to keep my shoulders back for a picture because I was constantly told that I was slouching. And I can feel that, and it's really tangible. And so that's where that moment of like being able to reclaim control comes in, and I'm able to kind of distance myself between me and those pictures. And so coming back to parents' relationships with their trans kids, and I think it's really important to make space for their kids. And so all this process of healing that I've had, this was a process that was made possible by other people's support. Like, I would not have been able to do this alone. And I was constantly told that my feelings are valid, and also to not feel any guilt or shame in being trans in relation to them, like separating their feelings of grief or fear from me, and making sure that I knew that my being trans wasn't causing that. Like, those are feelings that they're having, and they're valid, but it's not something that I need to feel responsible for. Yeah, so just making that space for people to explore that, and without asking them to be comfortable with anything before they're ready. And all that said, it's also very important to recognize that parents and family and friends will have a lot of emotions, and they'll be really complex, and they're going to be a lot to deal with. And so it's really important for people who are supporting trans friends or family members, or their child, which I think when it's your child, I think these emotions can be even more intense. It's so important to recognize that your feelings are also valid, and to not feel guilty for feeling all the things that you're feeling, and making sure that you also have support, whether that's from people who are professionally licensed to give that support, whether it's another friend, whether it's your partner, whether it's just someone else that you can talk about these feelings, and making sure that you're not projecting those feelings onto your kid, where now they have to deal with your own guilt and shame, internalize that guilt and shame, while they're also trying to deal with their own feelings around gender. I'm not a professional in any context. I can't speak for all people, but this is just what I've found helpful to think about, and what my family and friends have found helpful to think about.
I think that was perfect, though. I mean, I think it enlightens that topic and that subject. I know that that we've even had times where I'll say, I'm not sure if I can share this picture or this photo. And you've
Mm-hmm.
been, good about hearing me ask that. And I don't have a problem not, having it up or sharing it or looking back on it, because, those do exist. They are there.
Mm-hmm.
And you've been very gracious about that as well. Pono, I just want you to know how much I love you. And I thank you so much for doing this with me. It was a big deal. And I know it was awkward for both of us sometimes, because here, neither one of us had done an interview. You're
Yeah.
6,000 miles away. And it's a heavy duty topic, but I think it's important. It's valid. It's really wise of you in your young years to be open to communicating this. And I'm hoping that other people will hear that from you as well. As we go forward, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in today to That's Not Proper. I'm hoping we're going to talk to Pono, and wow, I don't know if can I say her name?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay. I'm hoping shortly here we're going to be talking to Pono and Miriam. I don't know. Do I call her your girlfriend?
Yeah, girlfriend, partner.
Okay.
Um,
Miriam, I thought I'm going to be cutting a lot of this out, obviously. Miriam is Pono's partner, and we are hoping to hear shortly in the future have a conversation with the two of them with regards to their relationship and navigating all of that. And I'm very excited because I haven't even gotten to meet Miriam yet, but she's with my siblings, so we'll just do the meet and greet over the 6,000 miles. Anyhow, all right. Thank you very much, Pono. I love you, and people keep on listening to That's Not Proper.